Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tova Kasdan, and I'm so pleased to be here today. Thank you to your professors for the invitation to come here. I'd first like to start by telling you a little bit about myself in my career in domestic violence, and then I'd really like to have a talk. It's not about me lecturing, it's about us discussing together, because this is how we learn about the topic. So by way of background, I'm an attorney. I'm a lawyer. I specialize in domestic violence. So currently, I'm the director of the Elder Safe Center, which is this brochure, which safeguards seniors from abuse. We protect older adults who are experiencing domestic violence, people who are 60 years of age and above. Before that, in my, I've always been in the domestic violence field, but before I did this, I was a prosecutor in Montgomery County, and I specialized in domestic violence cases as well as gang cases. So my job was really to work with those victims who are abused and for them to be able to seek protection from the court for criminal acts that were done and against the law against them, and be able to help protect them and their children. I've also worked in nonprofits specializing in domestic violence, and before my current position, I've worked for 5 years as a consultant, helping the World Bank, the IMF, and the IDB, which are international organizations, come up with best practices to address domestic violence response and prevention. So for me, it's all about education. And so I love to come out and talk to people of all ages, because domestic violence doesn't just affect a certain group of people from a certain ethnicity, from a certain part of the world. It affects all of us. So how many of you know, how many people would you say are affected by domestic violence? The statistics are really astounding. Does anyone have a guess? 1 in 4 women in their lifetimes will be a victim of domestic violence. 1 in 3 will be a victim of sexual assault. Domestic violence and sexual assault can happen to anyone, and it can happen to men as well. However, the vast majority of people affected by domestic violence and sexual violence are women. Okay, women and children. So it's important that we understand this topic. I say, and I have 2 sons, so I say if you're a man, you are just as much part of this discussion, because we want to have a dialogue where men appreciate women and appreciate their viewpoints, appreciate that equality and power and control should not be one way or the other. If you're a woman, you need to know this, because if you ever find yourself in an abusive relationship, or if you're a man or a woman and have a friend, a brother, a sister, an uncle, a mom, a grandmom, anyone who's affected by abuse, you're now able to know where to call. And these brochures are resources to be able to assist you, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So I know you've had a little bit of an introduction to domestic violence, but I want to take a moment to really talk to you about what you think that means. So when you think of domestic violence, what's the first thing that usually comes to your mind? What do you think about in your mind's eye when someone says that someone committed domestic violence against another person? Do you have an image in your head? Anyone? What do you think about?
Yeah, person can hit.
Okay, excellent. So a hitting, a physical touching that you don't want someone to do. So hitting, any other kinds of physical touching that would be domestic violence?
Okay.
Punch. Excellent. Hitting, punching, spitting. What else?
Sexual harassment.
Sexual harassment, you're right, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. You're right. Using someone in a way to elicit power and control over them, and that's done a lot through sexual harassment. We're going to talk about that. So physical is more like pushing, slapping, pinching, spitting, shoving, doing things that none of us want. And in the law, that's called non-consensual. It means you didn't want it to happen. You didn't consent for it to happen, and someone did it to you anyway. If someone did that to you, how would you feel? If someone did that to you on the street, what would you feel like? Angry. Anything else? Maybe frightened? Someone come up and imagine the person doing this to you is someone who says that they love you. An intimate partner, someone you're dating or someone you're married to. A father, a mother, or another sibling, okay? So domestic violence really is about relationships, okay? We're not so much talking about the stranger on the street, although of course that happens too, but we're talking about power and control in relationships, okay? So physical is what we mostly think of. How about sexual? Anyone know any ideas about how sexual abuse could be used against your will or in a domestic violence type of situation?
Like if one of the couple doesn't want to have anything and the other one first.
Okay, so if you're in a relationship and one person in that relationship wants to have sexual relations and the other person doesn't, but does it anyway, that's sexual assault, okay? So that's an excellent definition. Do you think if you're married that you have the right to have sexual relations with your partner no matter what, even if they say no? Okay. You don't. A lot of that's a hard issue for some people. Sometimes culturally, people identify as maybe a man being in control of the relationship and dictates the terms. If I want to have sexual relations and you don't, that's too bad. You need to do it anyway. But that's not equal. That's not having the same balance of power because you are an independent person in that relationship and should be able to dictate that. You mentioned sexual harassment, okay? That's a really important topic. So suppose that could happen where someone is objectifying you. So this might be outside of a relationship. Maybe it's a teacher-student relationship where someone touches you or implies that if you do something, come meet me after class, and if you, kiss me, then maybe you'll get an A on that exam. Is that okay? That's not okay because they're exerting their power over you. Who has the power in that relationship? The teacher or the student? Teacher. Okay, the teacher. So if the teacher misuses that power, then that is an example of sexual harassment, okay? So about 5 years ago, which is really how I came here today, I did a program here on sexual assault and rape on college campuses, which I think is a really important topic. So let me ask you this. Do you think if you're drinking alcohol and you pass out and you're unconscious that someone has the right to have sexual relations with you? No. Why is that no?
Because you're not conscious.
Because why?
You're not conscious.
Okay, you're not conscious. So were you able to say yes that you wanted that to happen? You weren't able to consent. So the word consent means you are able to express that you want it to happen. So if you're passed out, you're not able to do that. Okay? So if you're a person who is thinking about, oh, can I do this? That is actually against the law. Okay? So I wanted you to be aware of that. So within a relationship, whether it's dating or married relationship, it's the same thing. You have the right to say no if you don't want sexual relations to occur. What are other types of abuses? We talked about physical, we talked about sexual.
Mental.
Verbal, mental. Give me some examples.
As a mental abuse, the abuser can, how can I say, the abuser can make the person feel worthless.
Excellent, okay? So if you call someone enough names or you treat them so disrespectfully for a long enough period of time, how are they gonna feel? Just like you said, worthless, no self-esteem, okay? If someone comes home every night and says that I'm ugly, I'm fat, I'm worthless, no one else would want me, am I gonna feel good about myself? No. What are other examples of verbal abuse? Psychological abuse.
Like, for example, if he gets angry for something, he will start using, bad words.
Okay.
Or
So good example. So if you put someone in fear, that is also a form of psychological abuse, okay? So maybe, and this is what's interesting about domestic violence, it's not always physical. So maybe the person who committed the abuse hit the person once, but they were in fear that that could happen again. And they would shout and say, if you don't do this, if you don't cook me a dinner, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna slap you. So you're afraid even though I didn't touch you, okay? So that could happen. Other ideas about that? That's pretty powerful. Did you have anything? Okay. A lot of people will say, even though physical sounds like you'd be hurt the worst, a lot of people say it's the psychological abuse that's actually the hardest to take, because someone who purports to love you is actually psychologically causing damage to you, and that can be very traumatizing. That could make you feel like you might not be able to do something that you want to do again, feel good about yourself. So it's very, very important to recognize that. Any other kinds of abuse?
I don't know how it calls, but I know that sometimes they use like little children to manipulate.
Excellent, excellent. So that is a really important component of domestic violence. Oftentimes children are used in the power and control relationship for the abuser to keep power over the person that he's abusing, okay? So I think you had a speaker the other day that talked about, power and control, the power and control wheel, how that works. So the only way domestic violence can work is if someone has an imbalance of power over the other person. It's a pattern of abusive behavior where one person has way more power than the other. So your example of children is really excellent, and I'll tell you why. Suppose you're a woman who is being abused and you have 2 children, and your abuser is saying to you, if you ever try to leave me, I'm going to take those children and you're never going to see them again. That happens all the time. So you're the abused victim in that relationship. What are your thoughts? Do you love your children?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
You don't love your children?
No, maybe I didn't understand.
Oh, that's okay. So I was asking, do you love your children, your little ones? You might want to protect them, right? So if someone says that they're going to take your children from you and you'll never see them, you'll never see your children again, how do you think you're going to feel? Bad? A little bit louder? Angry?
It's like that abusing you.
Abusing you? Psychological abuse, right? That person may have never laid their hand on you. But for me, I'm a mom of 2 boys. If someone threatened to take my children, I think I would be paralyzed. I think I would be unable to move for fear that something would happen to them. That's how a lot of women feel in abusive relationships, because the abuser knows, how is he maintaining all the power, right? Now he's bringing the kids into it. So it's not just about him hitting or calling you names or sexually abusing you. It's now turning the children and saying, listen, you make one move and that's it. You may not see your children again. And I've worked on cases where abusers have abducted, which means taken the children without permission, to another country, to another state. And sometimes it is very difficult legally to try to get someone back, because there's a lot of complicated laws, and not every state and not every country. In the states you can, in the countries, some countries don't recognize that they need to return the children. And sometimes in the state, the abuser might go and file an order and make up a story that makes it look like she's the one harming them. And so the court may not understand what the true story is. So this is real life. This happens every day. There's another kind of abuse which is really common, and I see it a lot. Right now I work with older adults who are being abused, and it's called financial abuse, okay? Or financial exploitation. So what does that mean to you?
For example, if I live where grandpa, I will take her money for the social security or something.
Excellent.
Given to them.
You could teach this class. So suppose you are charged with doing a certain thing. And I'd like to use the example that you did of you're the granddaughter and you're helping grandma. But you're only supposed to help grandma, let's say, pay the bills, pay the electricity, pay for food. But grandma, let's say, has $10,000 in her account. Maybe she's getting some government subsidies. Maybe this is hard-earned money she's earned over the years. And all of a sudden you say, I really need a new car. I really could, I'll pay her back eventually. I'm just going to take $5,000 out of that account and buy myself a car because I really need to get to school. Are you allowed to do that? No, okay. So you've overstepped your limits with that relationship. That happens a lot with older adults who may not be able to keep track of their checkbooks as much, or they're relying on you and they love you and they trust you, and then you misuse that trust, okay? It also happens in relationships that are in the younger generation. Maybe you're dating or you're married to someone, and I see this a lot, even when the victim is working and she won't see a penny of her paycheck. He monitors that money, it goes in an account, and she's not allowed to take money out. A lot of times the abusers will count the change if you go to the store, won't let you buy new clothes for yourself or for your kids. And this is more than just couples negotiating the boundaries of what, their budget is. This is about not having control over money. And if you don't have control over your money and you're being abused, what do you think is going to happen? Are you able to walk out that door tomorrow when the abuser starts threatening you? Why not? Say it. You're scared? Do you have any funds? Do you have any money to put down a deposit on an apartment? Okay, so if someone financially controls your situation, that is also very problematic, okay? So, do you think all of these different types of abuses happen separate from one another, or do you think sometimes they can happen together? Sometimes they can happen together. So there's a word for that. It's called co-occurring. Co-occurring. That means that someone might be financially abusing you and physically abusing you and or emotionally abusing you, and sometimes all of the above. Sexually abusing you. This can happen. So it's not just one or the other. Sometimes it happens all at once, and that's called co-occurring. So if you are in a situation where you're experiencing multiple forms of abuse over a long period of time, we said it before, you might feel worthless, you might not feel good about yourself because your abuser is calling you names, your abuser is frightening you, your abuser might be threatening to take your kids or hurt your family members. And then on top of it all, if you're from perhaps another country or you have limited language accessibility, you may not know what resources to turn to here in Maryland or the United States, and you might not even know it's a crime, because in some nations it's not a crime. So you're further isolated because you may be in a new environment, or you might be living with relatives and you might not want to stir the pot. So this can be really complicated. So does anyone have any questions before I go on about the different types of abuses and how they might happen together? Does that make sense? How that might happen? Okay. So let's talk a little bit more now about why someone stays in an abusive relationship. Okay, I know you touched on this the other week, and now hopefully you've had a little bit of time to reflect about that. Okay? Do you think anyone wants to be abused? No. Okay. So no one, can we agree on that? Nobody wants to be abused, okay? Nobody wants to be treated. It's like the old adage, you treat someone how you would want to be treated, okay? So no one feels good when they're being abused, okay? But have any of you been curious as to why someone might not leave if it's that bad? Why don't you just leave? Even if you don't have money, even if you don't have any resources, why can't you just leave?
Because it's going to get better.
Okay, great. You think it's going to get better. That's a really important answer. Why do you think it would get better? If my husband's been beating me for 5 years in all the ways we've just talked about, why on earth would I think it would get better the next year?
Because you think it's your fault and then you need to work on it.
Okay, so excellent. If your abuser is telling you it's all your fault, okay, you can change. If you didn't do this, if you didn't make me so mad, if your cooking wasn't so awful, then I wouldn't have to come home and slap you. It's all inward, right? You think it's you. So a lot of people describe that as walking on eggshells, okay? Have you ever been around a person with a really bad temper and you're thinking, all right, let's just keep things calm. I don't want to do anything to set him or her off. But is it you who's setting that person off or triggering them to be angry, or is it them? Okay, who controls your emotions on the inside?
Myself.
Okay, only you, right? I might say something. I might come up to you and say, oh my goodness, you're wearing a baseball cap that's, what team is that? The A's? And I'm a Nats fan. Why are you wearing that hat? And I start yelling at you. And if you stood up and hit me, that would be a problem, right? Because even though I'm insulting you, you control how you react to that, right? So it's not just about triggering someone, okay? So a lot of it is about understanding. A lot of victims blame themselves, that this is my fault, okay? If only I was a better wife, a better mother, could do this, could do that. And it takes women or, or men who are being abused an awfully long time sometimes to realize that it's not probably going to change. It's the very rare person who goes through a tremendous amount of counseling. It's called abuser intervention, okay? Abuser intervention program, which means you try and change behaviors, okay? It's often very hard to change these types of abusive behaviors. So unfortunately, the success rate of those abuser intervention programs are very, very small, okay? So you may think, okay, I have no other choice, I have no other family, I'm here by myself in this country, I have to make the best of it, all right? What would be some other reasons why you think someone might not leave?
One of the reasons is like when you love your partner, like your husband, you just gonna think, oh, he's gonna change, let me just stay because,
Right.
That crazy love, you don't wanna leave.
Right. So that's a really important answer. A lot of us would say, well, how could you possibly still love him? He's done all these horrible things to you. But oftentimes, the person who's being abused, she doesn't want to stop loving him. She still believes in him, but she wants the abuse to stop. And it's that hope, that belief sometimes that keeps people in it. Okay? Any other thoughts or reasons why?
If you have a kid, so you don't want to leave your partner because of your children, you will say, oh, I don't want to be my kid to feel like bad, they don't have that,
Right.
two parents raising them together.
Right.
So you can stay for your children too.
That's a great answer too. Sometimes there's underpinnings that may be based in religion or culture or just your personal belief system that you think your children should be raised in a family that's, perfect, and mom and dad, or mom and dad, whatever the case may be. And you think, if I do this, my children will be worse off. But really, children are very affected by domestic violence. There's a lot of research on this. Children can have physical, psychological, deep-seated behavior problems. And I went to a conference this year, which was fascinating, that showed that if you experience abuse, either firsthand, which means I'm the one experiencing it, or I'm a child, and I'm a child witness, which means I'm watching the abuse, that you can have long-term health problems like heart problems, diabetes, really, really traumatic mental health trauma issues because you've been in that environment. So sometimes people, it comes from a good place, but mistakenly think, oh, if we stay together, it's better for the kids. Actually, it's worse for the kids, okay? So that is something that is a myth. What's another reason why someone might stay?
It's not really a reason that I've been thinking about it. I don't know if I'm going faster. It's that you've been doing this, and it's possible that someone can go to the court and make up a story and say, yeah, my partner is doing this and this to me.
Okay.
How they can prove it?
Right.
And I think that can be something that can stop someone.
Okay.
Because you don't have a proof, you don't know what you say, and people will
Right.
believe you. So you can.
So I'm really glad you brought that up, because that was going to be the next topic I was going to talk about. A couple of the handouts I gave you, this one in particular, talks about strategies for a safer future. This is what's called a protection order guide. Has anyone ever heard of the word protection order before? So this is when we're going to talk about the courts a little bit. So a protection order is something that may be called a different name, but is obtainable in any state within the United States. Sometimes it's called a restraining order. protective order, protection order. It's the same idea, but different states have different criteria, eligibility requirements, or length that the order is good for. So any person can go to the court. So if you live in Maryland here, like down the street is the Silver Spring, district court, you can go to the district court or the circuit court, and you can file what's called a petition for protection order. And a petition means you're writing out what happened to you. So petitions that I've seen might say, I'm afraid of my husband because he's threatened to kill me, is an example, okay? Which could be, I'm afraid because he's threatening to take the kids, right? So you would need to tell the judge why you are afraid or what happened. Were you assaulted? Were you threatened? There's criteria, and this guide lays out the criteria. If the judge hears the case and you've met the standard of proof, which means you've shown that you, in fact, have been abused, then you are granted, and this can happen in different stages. There's a temporary order and then a final order. You're granted what's called a civil order of protection, which means if you and I were in a relationship together and I got this civil protection order that said no contact, that you would not be able to come and have contact with me during the term of this order. So if we live together, what do you think that would mean? Are you going to be able to still live together? No. Probably not, although sometimes they do these orders that are called no harassing contact, which means you still might be able to live together, but not harass. That's a little bit of a stretch. I'm not the hugest fan of those because really, if someone is abusing you, you may need a little separation like that. So you can go to the courts. Now, you brought up an important point. That is the civil side. There's also criminal, okay? So the civil means you can file on your own. Criminal says, suppose we were having a fight and the neighbor heard a commotion and called the police, and the police officer came and interviewed us separately, which is the best practice, and I showed him that I was bruised because you hit me. The officer can file charges. That would be called an assault, and I would then have to come to court, and you would be tried as the defendant, and I would be the witness for the state of Maryland, and I would be able to tell the judge what happened. I don't have control over those proceedings. If it's criminal, that means a prosecutor, which is the job I used to do, decides whether there's enough evidence, okay? Whether there's enough evidence, physical injury, testimony. And what happens a lot in these cases, and happened to me a lot when I was a prosecutor, is for all the reasons that we've talked about, you might be afraid or feel worthless or unsure. What happens when you go to court? Do you think the person being abused wants to stand up there and tell the court what happened? So why not?
Because nervous, afraid.
Nervous, afraid. So abuse can actually escalate. It can increase when you actually try to seek help. That is one of the things that is very challenging for victims. Sometimes abuse can get worse because what is the abuser thinking? If you go to the court and you tell someone else outside of your family what's going on, do you think the abuser feels that he has the power and control over you anymore? No, because what's going to happen next?
He loses the power.
Someone's going to step in and try to protect you, but someone said he might try to kill you. That could happen too. So we have ways in which the legal system can protect us, but there's a flip side to that, and this was my very long wind-up to get to your concern, which is sometimes a person will go to court and not tell the truth. Okay? So this has happened in cases that I've worked on where the abuser, the person who's doing the abuse, will come to court, he'll fill out the petition and say, she pushed me and I have this scratch now and she assaulted me. And if you don't know the whole story, he might indeed have a scratch on his arm, but that might be because she's trying to get him off of her when he was assaulting her, okay? This has been a challenge. I'll be honest with you, the court system is not perfect. It is really far from perfect, okay? You don't always have the perfect result, which means injustice happens. However, I'm a huge fan that the most education you can give judges and pardon me, and people in the community to understand domestic violence, hopefully the better chances that the truth will come out in court. And the person who's charged with hearing the truth, whether it's the judge or the jury, a jury is made up of 12 people who listen to the case, will have a better understanding. I learned a lesson very early on as a prosecutor. When you're a prosecutor, you don't just have one case. You have like hundreds of cases. And I had a case in court one day that I didn't know very much about because I just got it. And the charges said that a woman took a knife and tried to stab her husband in the back in the kitchen, okay? So if you just read that, what are you thinking? What would be a logical thing that you're thinking? Who's the abuser? The woman. Oh my God, I'm thinking this woman's crazy. She tried to like stab her husband in the back. However, a very valuable lesson that I learned is really to take a deep dive into the case, and the more that I learned about it, I saw that he had been beating her for years, and he was about to reassault her, and she picked up the knife to defend herself, okay? So I realized I should not be prosecuting her. I should really be dropping that case because he was the abuser, and she was so frightened of him when he was coming towards her that she picked up the knife to defend herself, okay? So you bring up a good point. It's not always as it seems, and you need to ask questions. If you're a victim of abuse, this is why we often say you should go to court, or you should tell someone if you're interested in seeking legal protection as soon as possible, because the more that the time expires, a judge might say, this happened 3 months ago, why are you coming here now? And then he could stand up and say, she's just mad because I was with another woman, so she's making this up. So if the judge can't decide and isn't sure, do you think they're going to grant the protection order? Probably not if you haven't met the standard of proof. So it is very important. And this is really hard for abused victims to go in early because for all the reasons we talked about, a lot of times they think it's going to get better. They want to hang in there for the kids. They're scared because he might say, if you leave me or you go tell someone about this, I'll kill you. That's pretty scary stuff. So this can be very difficult, okay? Not to mention that sometimes, you know, putting the person in jail may not be the best resolution. I had a woman stand up in court once and she was just beside herself because I was saying that the husband should go to jail. This is multiple offenses against her. She got incredibly worked up and she like fainted in the courtroom, and because she was worried about like money and everything that was going to go into, she wasn't sure she could survive. She doesn't want to be beat up, but she also doesn't want to be left homeless. This is a really real concern. We have domestic violence shelters in our community. Does anyone know what a domestic violence shelter is?
I think it's like building where they have like special rooms for example, women and their kids.
Yes.
Because they can stay there.
Okay, so that's great. A shelter is a safe haven, somewhere where you can stay. Do you know how long you can stay there? Not very long, like 30 to 60 days. Do you think that's enough time to get on your feet, get a job, do everything you need to do? Sometimes women leave and they don't even have the clothes. They have the clothes on their back and no other personal belongings. So shelters sometimes accept donations for like, you know, soap and things like that, because when you leave, sometimes you are out of there. So it's a very scary situation. We have a real lack of temporary housing for abused women and children and other victims of crime. So it's not so easy to just walk away, because after 30, 60 days, unless you're one of the lucky ones to get into transitional housing, you're gonna have nowhere to go. So I run a shelter for older victims of adults, and it's within a long-term care, healthcare setting, which means some of you might know it as like a nursing home, places where older adults go who can't care for themselves. And I can tell you, even older adults, because as we know, domestic violence happens across the lifespan. You know, even people in their like 70s and 80s are still assaulting each other, sexually assaulting each other, psychologically abusing each other, financially, and they're still afraid to leave. They might have endured 50 years of abuse with this person. So I've been enlightened in this past year because I cannot believe the horrible things that people do to older adults. And they need a safe shelter. But where do they go after that, right? You don't want them to return home to the abuser. So these are real life concerns that we have. So I wanted to ask if there's any questions right now. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. Like, what happens if depend, like, there's a domestic violence, but actually between, for example, the son hitting the mom,
Right.
and the immigration status is like
Right.
they are illegal. How that can?
Right. Okay. Great point, and I'm so glad you brought this up. So another barrier is like a reason why someone might not go for help is because of their immigration status. So a lot of people are afraid that if they call the police, that the police might come for a different purpose, right? You might call them because you want protection because there's family violence going on, but if they come and find out that you're not legal here, what is the fear? Right, that they will investigate and then you may be deported or your family member. That is a real concern, okay? So there's been some advocacy efforts to try to protect domestic violence victims in these circumstances. And this is something that I'm familiar with in that a lot of, and I learned this throughout Maryland, it's not always consistent, right? So one jurisdiction, one town might do it one way and the other town might do it the other. One might be more strict about reporting, but really they should be there for the protection of the victim and they should not be reporting. But an officer, if they, take down your name and see that you're illegal, the officer may need to do what he or she may need to do. So it's a very tricky situation. There are legal protections for folks who don't have immigration status but are experiencing domestic violence, okay? And there's organizations that work on that. There's something called the Violence Against Women Act. So there's a VAWA petition. There's something called a U-Visa. If you cooperate with police and you're able to say what happened, you may be able to apply for a special visa protection for victims of violence who are experiencing family or domestic violence. And there's an organization in Maryland, it's the Women's Law Center, and they help on immigration. There's lots of immigration resources. For Spanish speakers, there's Ayuda in the DC metro area. So there are a lot of organizations, but it is a really serious problem. So you're right. I would say that, that should, it's easy for me to sit here and say, oh, you should still call the police, but that is a reason why a lot of abusers stay with the power and control in the relationship, is because they can always say, if you call the, you call the police, you're out of here, I'll make sure that you don't stay in this country. So that is another way to keep the woman or abused victim in the relationship, okay? So yes, very real concern. Other questions?
But I don't think so that is the only case for women. Because some of the women who have papers can have the man in the house and do the same thing too. That try to abuse the man, not physically,
right,
but financially.
Right.
Tell me, if you don't give me
right.
this, you don't do it for me, I will call
right.
immigration on you.
Right.
So what kind of abuse you call for?
Right. No, it's abuse is abuse. Okay. Typically, I use the term victim is woman and abuser is man, not because it can't happen the other way, but the vast majority, over 90% of the cases are. Now, absolutely, men can be victims of violence, and violence happens in same-sex relationships. So if two men are together or two women are together, that also can happen. It's not just in heterosexual, it's also in homosexual relationships. So yes, women can be perpetrators of abuse, absolutely. It happens typically in smaller numbers, and if you think about it, historically, male privilege. Men have had most of the power, at least, you know, in America and often in many countries where the power structure is such that maybe in certain countries women don't have certain rights. Maybe they can't go to school. Maybe they can't own property. Maybe they can't, you know, do things that are more equality, more egalitarian. So the male privilege historically has created a framework by which most abuse, you know, is perpetrated from, you know, someone with more power to someone with less power. And in most relationships, that would typically be a man to a woman. However, it absolutely can happen the other way. Certainly, women can abuse men. Certainly, women can abuse children. I mean, we see examples of this every day in the news. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah.
So is the same domestic violence if like the children are abusing to the mom or what?
So typically, there's kind of terms of art, and I'll explain them. Domestic violence or intimate partner violence, which is IPV, intimate partner violence, that is typically from one spouse to spouse or dating partner to dating partner of any sexual persuasion, okay? If it's happening more broadly in the family, let's say mom or dad is hurting kids, or grandson, older adult, is hurting older adult grandma, that's called family violence, okay? So a lot of people will say it more generally. It's not like it's so wrong to say that it's domestic violence if it's anyone outside of the intimate partner relationship, but technically speaking, if you're going to be technically correct, domestic violence and intimate partner violence mean dating or a married partner, and family violence is within the broader family spectrum. And a lot of cases, especially those outside the United States, you may have more intergenerational violence. So in communities where it's more common for multi-generation families, maybe grandma lives in the house with, you know, I've had cases where because of the structure in the culture, it's acceptable for mother-in-law, okay, husband's mom, to beat wife and husband beat wife, okay? Because she's with him. She's the mother-in-law attached to the male privilege, okay? So I've had cases of intergenerational violence. So imagine if we talk about why can't you leave, you might not just have one abuser, you might have multiple abusers. Imagine that. And I talked to this woman the other day, and I found it fascinating because she said to me, even after decades of abuse, mother-in-law was brutal to her, beat her all the time. And she finally said, you know what? I want to work, I want to get outside of this, and was able to kind of get a little more financially independent. And even after all that, mother-in-law fell sick. There came a time where she didn't live inside their home, and daughter-in-law still felt obliged to take her back in on her deathbed and care for her, okay? That is very comprehensive cultural overlays, okay? So by that I mean that it's just not so easy to say, are you crazy? Why would you go care for someone who has beat you senseless for decades? There's a very strong familial and cultural bond there, and she felt it was her duty to do that, okay? She's not a weak woman. She's not a woman who's not brave. She's not a woman who doesn't respect herself. She's a woman who felt very conflicted. Okay, so these are very real issues. They're not so easy. Okay, domestic violence I find to be challenging. I'm in this field because I really want to help people, but human relationships are also very fascinating and not so easy to solve just like that. Okay, there's a lot of psychology in it. There's a lot of ways in which you have to think. It's not just about what would I do, it's about really putting yourself in that person's shoes and seeing what might be the barriers to leaving. And it's complicated, it's very complicated. Other questions?
Yeah,
Yes.
I have one. So, as an attorney lawyer, like someone is abused like psychologically, what kind of evidence you need for that person? Because
Okay.
like, physically you can see.
Great.
Like somebody who's like, what kind of evidence we need on that?
Right.
Who,
So
like that person is very abused?
So great question. The question is, how do you prove psychological abuse?
Right.
This is a very difficult response, okay? Under the law, typically psychological abuse is not recognized unless it rises to a certain level, okay? So let's just take Maryland for instance. If I'm harassing you or threatening you, saying I'm gonna kill you, that's a threat, that's something that is recognized under the law. You can get a civil protection order for that. You can be prosecuted in the criminal court for that. However, if someone is just eating away at your self-esteem and just nasty to you and mean, and it's absolutely abusive, but if it doesn't rise to the level of a recognized crime, so all the crimes are laid out in what's called a statute, different statutes lays out what each crime is. Yes, it's abuse, but it may not be recognized criminally under the law, so you may not be able to prosecute that person for psychological abuse unless it rises to the level that it's actually recognized as harassment or threats or stalking behavior. Stalking, does everyone know what stalking is? Stalking is when you, sometimes people try to leave an abusive relationship and the abuser really doesn't want to let them go for all the reasons we talked about and may GPS them like on the phone, constantly track them in the car, call them incessantly, bother them at work so that they try to lose their job, even though you're not supposed to be fired for domestic violence, all these reasons. So that is a recognized form of psychological abuse, stalking, but it has to be a real threat to your bodily harm. It is hard to prove. It is very hard to prove. Okay? Sure.
If somebody has proved that somebody is stalking that person, then how it works?
So you mean what can you do to help yourself? So that's where this guide comes in. So if someone is stalking you, bothering you, suppose you don't want to date someone anymore and they keep bothering you, you can get a civil protection order, okay? You can file that with the court. You can file that at the local district or circuit courts. And depending on the actual examples of what the stalking is, it may rise, also to a crime that can be prosecuted. It really depends on the evidence, and technology has been a blessing and a curse, I think, in our society, because there's a lot of harassment and stalking that is now being perpetrated on technology, right? The electronic leash, like you can't go anywhere with like, I saw you looking at that guy, you like him, right? And like all that jealousy is really being channeled through the technology. And a lot of women that I work with, sometimes the technology, whether it's spyware or GPS, the abusers will be tracking them and harassing them. So you don't feel like you can ever leave. And that is a form of psychological abuse. So just in looking at the time, I wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of resources, because that's really important. On the front cover of this guide, these are from the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, which is our state domestic violence coalition. We also have a state sexual assault coalition called the Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And we have all the agencies written, so depending on which county you're in, that is all of the 24-hour domestic violence programs. So you can always call them if you have any questions about resources, counseling, services, advocacy in court, things like that. There's lots of people who can help. So if you know of someone who's experiencing abuse or you're not sure if it's abuse, you can call and they can help you. And you can talk to them confidentially, okay? Nationally, there's something called the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and that is also a really important resource. So if you want to help someone, maybe someone you know is experiencing abuse and they're in a different state, call the National Domestic Violence Hotline, okay? So every county has a program. There's lots of people who can help, so I don't ever want anyone to feel alone. If you're afraid, you can still get help, and you take it as slow or as fast as you want it, and there'll be people to help you if you have any problems that you need help with, okay? Whatever career path you're going to pursue. I know a lot of you are interested in the healthcare field. There's such a strong correlation between domestic violence and healthcare. So, you'll run across this. A lot of Maryland has the most hospital-based domestic violence program. So if you should find yourself in the emergency room, they ask a series of standard questions to make sure that the injury in the hospital that you're going to be treated for in the hospital is not a result of domestic violence, okay? Because then they can help connect you to services. There's a lot of great opportunities. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And I'm here if you have any other questions. Thanks.
Thanks for
When is gonna be the